graduated, elevated. Now it's my time to shine. Yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves.
Hello and welcome to PhD Hard Talk. I am your host, Noma Mguni. Could you please introduce your research, institution, and who's funding you?
Thank you very much, Noma. My name is Daragh O'Leary and I'm an economics PhD researcher at University College Cork, funded by the Irish Research Council, and I primarily research firm dynamics, but today I'm going to be talking about a publication I have on the influence of social network use on life satisfaction across European countries.
Excellent. So let's start with the first question. What are social networks? I mean, so that the audience understands what it is and how they do work.
It seems like an easier question to answer than it might be. They're just content-based websites, social media platforms where you communicate and keep in touch with others. There's loads of different kind of vices for them. So the more social ones include like Facebook and Instagram, but obviously you've got more work-related ones like LinkedIn, and even Twitter can be, I suppose, a bit more professional. But they're just websites where you can create and share contact and communicate with other people.
Excellent. And in terms of social networks, what inspired you to embark on this journey to say, I want to write a paper? And what are the benefits of writing this paper as well?
Well, basically, I always had an interest in psychology. I was kind of torn between that and economics when I started out in college. But so there was a PhD student who was working in our department at the time, Sarah Lida-Volkmer, who's my co-author on the paper. And her master's thesis was on the influence of mobile phone use on life satisfaction or subjective well-being. I was like, God, that's so interesting. And then I found a data set that had the rate of social network use and life satisfaction, but it was across European countries. And I'm in the Spatial Regional Centre in the Department of Economics in Cork. So I'm interested in how economic activity varies across space. So I was looking through loads of the psychological research on the influence of social network use on life satisfaction or subjective well-being. And you see that a lot of it is just micro stuff. So they look at like small cases in small samples within certain countries. And I was going, it would be interesting to see if there's any variation in the effect of social network use across different spaces in Europe. So that's basically where the idea came. It was applying macroeconomic thinking to kind of just a psychological issue.
And in terms of your methodology then, what methodology did you pick and why?
I used a grand, boring, ordered probit method to assess. So the dependent variable for life satisfaction was just whether people weren't satisfied, marginally satisfied, or satisfied or very satisfied. So I basically just used an ordered probit so it indicates the probability of a unit increase in an ordered variable like the one that I had, given increases in other variables. So it was standard, straightforward. The reason I used it was there was two lecturers in my department had done something on subjective well-being before. The dependent variable was similar. So I just looked at their paper and I said, well, there's no reason to argue with that methodology. And I basically just used theirs and referenced theirs saying that I used it.
Excellent. And in terms of findings then, what were the conclusions and what were the negatives that came out of your research?
So the main finding of that paper was that we basically looked at how social network use, varying degrees of it, would affect life satisfaction. That's been well researched already, and the literature is clear enough that some social network use is good, but if you use it too much, you start getting these things like FOMO, or you start having kind of problematic addictive behaviors with social network use. So what I did was I stratified the data based on high, mid, or low performing regions. And the interesting stuff that we found was that in high performing regions, excessive use of social network use was a way worse for your life satisfaction than it was in medium performing countries. And in some low performing countries, it had the lowest negative effect on your well-being. And in some places, it even had a positive effect on it. So the basic findings of it were that the effect that social network use has on your life satisfaction varies across countries based on economic performance. And in addition to that, it can actually positively affect your life satisfaction if you're in very low performing countries.
Okay, so if we were to take your research model and we took it to Brazil, and let's say we take it to Mozambique That's in Africa somewhere.
Yeah.
And we take it to, I think,
Carlo in
China.
Ireland.
No, that's Europe. You've
Yeah.
run.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sometimes I
yeah. So
forget
we
Carlos
go.
in Europe.
Yeah, let's go to Asia. And, you know, we know that China, the economy is booming, per se. So if we compared those countries, just as a general discussion, this is your opinion, do you think the findings will be quite similar? Remember, in China, anything that goes on socials is literally watched.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that you cannot say, and there's certain apps that you cannot view. And I think with TikTok, for certain age groups, they've got like an educational piece. You just watch like things to do with school, nothing else,
Okay.
essentially. So now you've got that background. What are your thoughts? Do you think the findings will be similar or different?
Well, you see, this was I actually mentioned that in the paper, that that's one of the limitations of it. So we look at high, middle, and low performing regions, but our countries rather, but they're all in Europe. So even some of the lowest performing countries in Europe, relative to the entire world, are still kind of wealthy. I would imagine if it were to follow the same trajectory that the paper did, I think we'd find that social network use might be more useful in kind of undeveloped kind of or developing countries, like places like in sub-Saharan Africa. That would follow the trajectory of the paper, that those lower performing regions would derive more benefit from social network use. The China case is interesting because I know that we kind of have like relatively a large amount of freedom for social network use in Europe and in America. China is interesting because it is monitored a lot more closely, and I know we have Chinese colleagues that go back to China, and they don't have access to Facebook sometimes when they go back, so they can't communicate. It'd be a very interesting case study to do, because I think one of the things about social network use that makes it good but also makes it a terrible thing at times is that everyone is just free to chime in and, you know, tweet or message anyone about anything they want at any time. I would imagine that you'd get a completely different and interesting case study if you did it in China, where it was monitored so freely, and I'd imagine the content that gets put up isn't as it's not as kind of maybe interesting as some of the stuff in Europe because it's monitored too closely. So maybe that would impede on social network use's influence on life satisfaction in China, and it would make it more of a redundant tool.
Interesting. But then to move on from your research and to look at AI and data collection and trends, I mean, that's how you've got your data essentially. You know, what are your thoughts on AI? Because at the moment, you know, when we look at how data is collected by businesses, it can be quite frightening in terms of what they have about us. For example, if you look at Amazon, if you log into your Amazon right now, you know, they've got all the things that you've been searching for, baby stuff, if you're having a baby, that is, or shoes, what have you, you know, the exciting stuff. They look at your buyer behavior, you know, it's frightening in that sense, that, you know, the fact that they've got all this information about us. And I would like to think we need more regulation in terms of what they collect about us as individuals. But what are your thoughts? Because this is your sphere, essentially. Well, not directly, but yeah. What are your thoughts?
No, similar to you, it can be absolutely terrifying. There's nothing more scary than when you're talking about if it's a trip away to a certain location or a certain film that you want to see or a certain book, and then all of a sudden Facebook has a suggested ad for it, and you're going, oh Christ. Yeah, no, that certainly is terrifying. As someone who kind of uses data for a living, data can be incredible, and I think it gets a bit of a bad name. More access to data does help us solve issues, and it does give us a more clear indication of what's happening in society. The degree of monitoring that it can afford itself then, though, can be absolutely scary. I was at a conference a few months ago, and there was someone had done an entire paper, and he hadn't published it yet, but he had done the paper, and it was based on consumer migration during like the week. And you know, based on where people live, how far do they go for shopping and stuff like that. And the way he was able to do it was by tracking their cell phones, because like mobile phones emit like a signal every couple of, I don't know how long it is, I'd be pretending if I did, but he basically like was able to track the movement of certain mobile phone users. And I found it like it provided incredibly interesting results from a spatial economist point of view. Like it was really interesting, and if he didn't have the data, he wouldn't be able to do it. But it a lot of the monitoring seems to be invasive and nearly kind of it borders on George Orwellian kind of stuff. I'd agree with you. There needs to be regulation, but I think one of the big issues that we have is we have these things like buzzwords that we say, oh, GDPR and stuff like that. I don't really know what my rights are as someone with and I don't think most people do. I think it's one of those things that it's so hard to regulate for two reasons. One, because it's this dynamic thing that's ever evolving, and a lot of it is done by AI, so it's just kind of self-learning, and it's kind of nearly goes unmonitored. The other one is that I don't think people are aware how much they're being monitored, and they're not even aware of the ways they're being monitored. And like some of it is good, even though it can freak you out occasionally when like your iPhone suggests something that you've been talking about and it just has an ad for it. In a way, that's kind of good because it has helped me find products and services that I want. But I think it's one of those things that people's lack of understanding and awareness of it kind of makes it one of those things where some people don't even realize it's a problem. Like, but I think I'd be stepping outside my realms of expertise if I pretended to know any more than that.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of people, and which is the wider community, to those who are watching, you know, like you've rightly said, we don't know what our rights are. And the governments or the UN, they're not really taking an active role to inform us in terms of what is and what isn't. And I guess the question that I was trying to get to, or maybe the answer that I was trying to get to, is do you have any suggestions? Just if you were to think, you know, off the top of your head, what do you think would work?
Oh God. Do you know what? I'm sorry to give a really boring answer, Noma, but I honestly just don't know. And I know economists aren't supposed to say that, but I genuinely, I wouldn't have a clue to know how that could be better regulated. One thing I do feel that has come up with social media a bit more is there should be a greater level of transparency and traceability with social media profiles. I think more so for interactions with other people rather than kind of for the individual's protection. But based on stuff like you see in the media, like racial abuse that's like hurled at, like, say, footballers or whatever, the fact that anyone can set up accounts and that there can be loads of bot profiles and stuff like that, that all increases the data that's available for AI to take from and scrape from. And those aren't really tracked to anyone. You know, anyone can set them up. You can have multiple ones. You just need an email. You can create a burner email account in a few seconds. So I would say that maybe one thing, if we could attach maybe social profiles more so to people, like make it kind of that, make people take more ownership over the social profile account that they own, that would kind of maybe put them in a more invested place in it. And maybe that would help kind of further progress the culture of people wanting to know how they're being monitored, what their rights are, and so on and so forth. Maybe that would be the only thing I could suggest.
That's interesting. But then,
what do you think yourself?
In terms of it, well, what I think is we need an educational piece for the younger generations, those who are still in school, from like, I think year 6. I don't know how it works in Ireland. I think
we don't go to school.
You know what I mean? Like year 6, I think you're like 10, around there.
Oh, okay, so that would be 4th class here. We call that 4th class.
Okay, from 4th class or year 6, when you're like in year 10, I think as we start with the sex education classes, I think we should also have the IT or AI educational pieces for children.
That's a great idea. Actually, do you know what? I have a load of younger cousins who are, they're all girls, but they're all becoming teenagers now. But it amazes me how, like, they try to follow me on like my old Instagram account and stuff. I don't do it because I'm ashamed of my life of the stuff I used to put up on my Instagram and don't want them to see it.
Going to stalk you after.
Yeah. Oh no, no one gets locked down. There's but I was thinking that their parents really struggled with like what age they were going to get a phone, because they asked me and they said like, when did you get your first phone? And I said, well, I was 10, but like it was one of those flip up, like all you could do was play Snake on it. Like it didn't really do anything. But I can see that but I could see that they really struggled with like their daughters having access at like, 13 or 14 to stuff like, I mean, some of the stuff that's on TikTok is madness. Like, and the same with Twitter is just, can be a vile place as well, but they just have instant access to it. And I agree that there probably does need to be some kind of, the same way we have sex ed in school, there probably does need to be something on social media, because I think another one of those, it's similar to the data thing. A huge problem is just the information asymmetry between the parents don't understand it. Like it's not like when your parents are telling you how to drive. Like they know how to drive, they know what's bad, they know what roads are dangerous, they have an awareness of it. But my parents have no idea about like social media, TikToks, Facebooks, anything like that, and they don't really know what they are, and that makes it hard to guide, your children when they're going on. So I think that's a very good idea, and if you could do it for their safety, but in addition to that, explain what their rights are with regards to stuff like GDPR, that'd be fantastic. You've solved it, Noma.
I don't think I have, but then I've got an additional point to that, which is the adults as well, because I look at my parents, they have no idea. They've got an iPhone or they've got a Samsung, genuinely don't know what to do with it. And in terms of sending selfies, as you know, they're just floating somewhere. So if we can educate the elders, I would call them, I think that sounds responsible, and the young people, which is our youth, I think we can bridge the gap, because we've had to learn on the job in terms of you and I, and we're quite reactive and we're firefighting, and the law usually catches up like 10 years later. So we are like the bridge in between, if that makes sense, hence why they asked you. So I think both groups need education, and we continue to react, and then hopefully they'll catch up in the next 10 to 20 years, and then they can educate us, because we've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, you like you said, your IG, you weren't really proud of it, so the pictures, the videos on there, they're floating somewhere.
I bet there's nothing like incriminating on it. It's just like embarrassing photos. No, I know what you mean. And another thing I think as well with it is like maybe even beyond school, because like one of the things that's weird about social media is that it's like technology, like it changes constantly. Like even like there was one of my friends the other week, like 10 years younger than him, and he doesn't have TikTok. The sister was going like, well, how do you watch like shorts? And Alex, my friend, said like, oh, well, they put them up on Instagram. And she went like, oh, you use Instagram. Like, like she's got like, but it's like when we were kids, like, Instagram was like the new thing. Like that was insane. Like that was anything that was like, our first thing was Bebo, then that became totally outdated. And then like Facebook was the next big step. And then like, but like TikTok and Snapchat, if someone told me what they were when I was like 13 or whatever, I'd be like, sure, what's the point? There's no point in those. But like they become these massive things then, and you can't really predict what way they're going to go either.
Yeah, and I think the scariest thing that I've realized about Snapchat, not that I use Snapchat, but I was just in a conversation, and also WhatsApp in terms of the update, is that you can type something or you can send a video and it literally goes away once the person has seen it. So if some people, like in terms of trafficking, oh my gosh, that scares me. Trafficking.
It's a relatively safe way of communicating with people, because it wipes the. Now I'm sure there might be like an IT whiz or something could probably still get something out of it, but I agree with what you mean, like in terms of for personal kind of altercations and stuff like that, you've no evidence of stuff like once it's typed or seen. Now I think there is a function where you can save it, but you can only save like a line if they chat it to you. So like you're really limited with the amount that you can kind of hold on to. For example, if there was someone, like one of the negative aspects about social network use is it brings you open. Of course, it brings you open to positive social altercations, but there's also a lot of bullying goes on in it.
That's very true. And I guess moving on to Twitter. And I mean, in terms of community, I think I've seen a lot of community for PhD students and also postdocs. And I guess using your model, if you were to look at our community and research, what advice would you have for us? Just, you know, from what you've seen, I think we met on Twitter.
Yeah.
And we had a dialogue, and here we are, essentially. And I'm just thinking, what advice do you have for the, you know, the different communities that we have on there? Because we vent a lot and yet we say positive things as well. But
Yeah.
when you're looking at the trends, sometimes you can see a lot of negative. And then it's like you've walked into a world of, oh my gosh, am I in the right place? And then sometimes you see a lot of positive. And like, for example, when I see people going, ooh, I've got my doctorate, and I'm like, oh my gosh, high five, that would be me soon. I'm so
Yeah.
excited for them. But then sometimes when you see some of, like, we know, review or two comments, like, oh my gosh.
I'm dealing with a review or two at the moment.
Oh, do you need me? I'm ready.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Like it's kind of this thing of Twitter is insanely useful for academics. Like in terms of like I'm in an association called the Regional Science Association, the British and Irish section, and I can keep up with the work of like PhD students or like other like lecturers or academics within that association in my field constantly, just every day, despite the fact that they live in Wales or Scotland or the Netherlands or Germany or Scandinavia or whatever it is. It's obviously insanely useful from that perspective. One of the things that does kind of annoy me a bit about Twitter is that, particularly in the academic sphere, there seems to be a lot of people that want to just have arguments, and there seems to be a lot of people as well that want to virtue signal, and it can make it quite a hostile environment for people. Kind of like, I think it lends itself to being a very argumentative platform, because people, particularly within, say, the social sciences like economics and psychology and sociology, people are often discussing things that are a bit, you know, socially sensitive. Like in economics, like the employee wage gap that between, like, say, different races or different genders, that always sparks massive debate, and there's always a lot of, you know, there's always a lot of fights on Twitter. A lot of it can be negative, but so I think it's a useful tool, but you do really have to be careful with it, not getting into arguments with people. And there can also be, one thing I would also say is that there's a load of people I know that have gotten into arguments. People have attacked them because they've disseminated a bit of their research that people didn't agree with or whatever. But often not replying to those is probably the best course of action, just from what I've seen from like more senior lecturers in the department in University of College Cork, that sometimes there are just people that want to fight. So it can be quite a kind of vile place to kind of disseminate and open up discussions regarding research. But it's definitely very useful, particularly for stuff like if you want to disseminate research, or if you want to expand or like keep consolidating your professional network. Like us being able to communicate with each other is fantastic through social media, but then there might be people who will want to attack our research or stuff like that, and that can be, maybe sometimes it's warranted, but sometimes it can definitely be, stuff might get personal, so it can be quite a vile place as well. But it's one of those happy medium. It's like having a drink on the weekend. It's fantastic in moderation, but it doesn't it doesn't go well if you bring it into all aspects of your life.
Oh, and you just brought me to a point. You know, there's a paper that was trending. We won't mention whom, and I think you know the paper. And literally, it's been taken down just through the movement on Twitter, because the research was conducted in a different country by somebody, and it was ethnographic research, and you know, the respect lines, according to Twitter, they were rather blurred, and Twitter marched. And the paper was taken down. What's your opinion on that?
My opinion on that stuff is that I think if there's research that's done incorrectly, or if it's done in bad taste, or specifically, like, you know, I mean, at the turn of the previous century, there was a lot of research that would have tried to show the disparities between IQ or exam results between different races in America. And at the time, it was kind of lauded as, oh, this is fantastic research. It shows that there's a deviation. But years later, we realized, like, no, it's because, you know, different races grow up in different socioeconomic outcomes where their education services mightn't be as good. So there's definitely a place where some research is conducted badly and it reaches incorrect outcomes. in that case, of course, the door should be open to, no, that should be revoked. And that's largely what the scientific community is about. Like, you know, peer review, and like if something is proved false, reject it. If it's not, it can be supported and accepted. I do see what maybe the point you're getting at with the, does it open the door that unpleasant results could just be thrown away and cast aside, and it could lead people to kind of maybe researching safer areas. That's always going to be a threat. But I think that's always been something that's been in the scientific community, particularly within journals. I think you'll get that stuff as much from professional incentives for people to try and research certain research topics that are safe or only kind of incremental advancements, and that helps them generate output. You'll always have kind of perverse incentives in kind of research areas like that. Twitter is one of these new things that was never in the scientific community, but previously, like media, like, you know, books, newspapers and stuff, they would have been outraged by research in the past and gotten certain articles revoked from journals. So I think it's something that it's always been there, and it's just something we have to tread carefully with. It's obviously a more salient issue now because Twitter is just instantaneous, and you don't have to be a journalist at a newspaper in order to voice your opinion on Twitter. And I think that piece in particular you were talking about, that took off within like a day. That was like all over the world. You know, it was insane. It was insanely big. But that can be a helpful mechanism in the scientific community, and it can be a dangerous one. But I think journals generally, if they're going to revoke an article, they generally do it with good reason or good purpose.
Interesting. Thank you very much for your well thought out response, because you balanced both sides essentially. So it does show that
I had to, or Twitter would go mad.
Sorry?
I had to, or Twitter would go mad.
They'll never watch this.
Yeah.
So I guess we're moving on to the more generic questions in terms of advice for our colleagues at home. And I guess the first one, I received this question, which is in regards to grades and applying for a scholarship. So, you know, we know that sometimes when it comes to passing coursework or dissertations or, you know, modules, sometimes, you know, you're on the right path, but you don't really get the grade, but yet you're still passionate about, you know, going further and, you know, going to a PhD or a master's. So what advice do you have for somebody that's essentially not hit the mark, maybe for Oxford University, because those are the universities that I tend to, you know, the advice that I get for, you know, Harvard or Yale or, you know,
the Oxbridge.
Oxford. Yeah, elite. So, and I'm far from elite. So, you know, what advice do you have for someone that's embarking on that journey?
Well, I'd say, like, you'd be surprised how many academics aren't academic in the traditional sense of the word. Like, I was far from academic when I was in secondary school. I was a disaster, not the total disaster, but I didn't want to go on to college. I applied for economics more or less because I hadn't done economics at secondary school level. So I was like, oh, well, I'll just try this. I ended up obviously never leaving since, like, so I enjoyed it. But it's generally those things that, like, the Oxford and the Cambridges, and over here we have the Trinities. In America, obviously, there's the Harvards, the Yales, and all the Ivy League schools. I think that it's important to bear in mind that scoring well in exams or in tests, that's a measure of a certain type of intelligence. And there's a plethora of criteria you have to be successful as an academic. Academics, in the people that go on to like publish research papers, they're generally okay, they're generally good, but there's very few of them are like insanely high achievers at university level. I think Richard Taylor, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, his supervisors were asked what their expectations for him was when he finished grad school in America, and they just said, we didn't expect much. Like, there's a lot of people that struggle with it, but what I would say is, if you have a particular interest in an area, as long as you have the interest in that area and you do read and you do write academic papers and you have some bit of ability within doing assignments in certain coursework areas, if you have some bit of research inclination, that you're willing to learn how to do, you know, metrics and like kind of regressions and stuff like that, you can absolutely improve exponentially each year. Each year of my PhD, I realized how stupid I was the year before. Like, you know, because you just learn so much and keep going. But if you're not hitting the mark, like as in you're not getting 1-1s or first class honors, that does not mean you can't do a PhD at all. You can really, just as long as you find a good supervisor and one who's willing to take faith in you, and you know that you're interested in it and that you know you can do it. If you work hard and just try and replicate work that you see of other colleagues, you can absolutely do it. I wouldn't have any hesitation doing that. Obviously, you have to have some propensity in it, but remember that, like, when you're doing, like, say, an undergraduate course or whatever, you're probably going to be doing, like, you know, 7 modules a semester. Like, you're probably only going to have an inclination towards maybe 2 or 3 of those and enjoy 2 or 3 of those. Whereas when you get into PhD level, what you're actually doing is you're specifically going into the one that you like. Now, there'll be elements that you don't like. Maybe some people don't like data analysis or whatever, but those can all be overcome in anything you're going to do in life. There's going to be aspects you don't like. But I would say absolutely, if someone isn't hitting the mark massively in undergraduate, that does not mean they can't go on to be a PhD and be an excellent academic in their own right.
Excellent. Love that response. I guess the second question is, in your opinion, does education break the poverty cycle? Just looking at, you know, what's going on around you and, you know, attending conferences, you meet people that you wouldn't normally meet. But obviously we know when it comes to our dinero, sometimes debatable.
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
Oh, do you know what this was? I had a massive debate with people about this the other week. That I personally, as an academic, I do love education. I think it's fantastic. And there is, I mean, empirically, it would be incorrect to say it doesn't, to a certain degree, alleviate socioeconomic hardships. Like, I mean, my parents, one of them went to college, the other one didn't. And we kind of were, you know, now both me and my siblings have gone to it. We're going to go on to have good jobs. It does kind of alleviate, like, it does alleviate certain pressures, and people who go to college and do well, they do get better jobs. There is an issue, obviously, of course, that some people can afford to go to college and some people can't. Now, we have stuff like scholarships, and that helps to a certain degree. But what you get now is I was just talking about this the other day. I think education is nearly becoming devalued to a certain extent. So there is such an onus on going to college these days. It's nearly just like the next given thing that you do. Whereas previously, like when my dad was growing up, it was kind of, oh, you did the first 3 years of secondary school. Are you going to stay on to do the last 3 or 2? And that was the big thing. Whereas now the big thing is, like, it's a given that you go to college and you get a level 8. And that's all well and good. And in Ireland, the government does provide assistance for paying half of people's fees, and in some cases paying people who are particularly from challenging backgrounds, they'll pay all of their fees. But what that has done is that means that nearly everyone has a level 8 now. So now it's a case that, like, well, you really need a level 9 to stand out. And as you say, that's where you get the selection bias kind of a thing, where only rich people can afford to do masters after masters. So it's, in some ways, it kind of reinforces the poverty cycle. And our own, one of our, we call them TDs, but you'd call them MPs the other day. He was only advocating that we have to move away from this snobbish idea that, you know, everyone has to go to college, because college at the end of the day is really just studying a certain subject. It's not a passage right to a certain job. The only reason, like, I mean, you can study accountancy in an Irish university. I have loads of friends who studied accountancy for 5 years, and at the end of it, they're not accountants. It just means that a firm will take them on and they can do their professional exams, and then they'll become a fully chartered accountant. But so I do think it does help. It does help alleviate the poverty cycle, but I wouldn't give this kind of advice of kind of, oh, everyone should go to college. And anyway, because there's, I mean, some of the best ways to alleviate poverty, often they can be, you know, taking initiative and setting up businesses, and and people doing very well within their communities, and, you know, increasing their income that way. In addition to that, I think saying that education, from a government's point of view, saying, oh, everyone getting educated is the way to do it, it's kind of nearly a lazy response from the government's end, because it assumes that once they get educated, like they'll all solve themselves out. Whereas there's a lot of socioeconomically disadvantaged places in Ireland, and I'm sure in the UK as well, where the need to help provide economic mobility for those people, it goes far beyond needing to get them, you know, degrees. In some cases, there's like, you know, there's huge levels of crime in certain areas that need to be better policed, and even at like, there's in some ways, by the time people get to college age, maybe it's too late. You need to kind of improve services, and you need to improve funding towards supports at primary school level and at secondary school level. So it does definitely, if you look at it empirically, it does help alleviate economic conditions, and it does help people increase their economic mobility. But to a certain extent, it's not like kind of a silver bullet.
Insightful. I guess I've got 3 more questions, if you'd like to know. So in terms of gender pay gap, then, you know, you are in research, and I know that this is not your field, but we know that it is a topic that's literally on the tinternet, it's trending. And, you know, some people are angry, some people want to change, and some people are like, it's A-OK. So it's been like that. So what's your opinion on that?
My opinion, that's Jesus. This is that's a tough question. No, I find that amazing on Twitter that there's some people just really don't care about it, and then there's some people that it's the most important thing. My thing would be is, there's 2 sides to the debates, and generally the side that are saying it's a disgrace, they look at the disparity and they say that disparity is a disgrace. Men should or only earn the same amount as women, and I'd agree with that. You shouldn't be discriminated based on wage just based on your gender. That's ridiculous. Some people then on the other side of the debate will say stuff like, oh well, women work less, or they care for children more, that's why men earn it, and they pretend that it doesn't even exist, that the patriarchy doesn't exist. And they're both kind of clutching at straws of the one end. Like, the disparity is indisputable. Women on average earn less than men. Where I think there's a knowledge gap within the public the public discourse on it is that the gap arises for a plethora of reasons. One of them is discrimination. Like, there is evidence that females applying for jobs based on certain cover letters will get called back less than men. There is evidence of that, and in addition to that, women get passed over for promotion because sometimes at a certain point in their career they're liable to go and take maternity leave, and that's discrimination as well. So there are issues like that. There are other issues then that, like, women on average for some reason do tend to pick careers that are more low paid, so like, you know, health and education, whereas men tend to pick stuff like finance and engineering. Now that's a broad generalization, but it's just on average. So my kind of opinion on it would be, it does exist, and there are some reasons for the disparity are just discrimination based on kind of gender. But then there are some reasons for the disparity we should be more open to accepting, kind of why certain, like, if women on average choose certain types of careers that are associated with certain types of pay, there should be no what it's so unfair. There should be no kind of great wonder of why they're on average getting a lower wage. But there definitely are areas that it could be improved. I think one of the main ways to do it would be they have to look at maternal care. I don't know what the system is over in the UK, but in Ireland at the moment, I think, I can't remember how long the woman gets, but it's like, let's say it's like, you know, a couple of months or whatever. I think the man gets 2 weeks. So I would think implicitly there, the Irish government, the onus is very directly on the woman has to take care of the child. I think if they opened that up and they made it a parental leave that was shared between people, I think that would help solve that disparity a lot, because then men and women are as likely as each other to take the parental leave, on paper anyway. Whether they do or not is kind of a different thing. You see that in Sweden have tried that, and they find that that does help the disparity a certain amount, but they do find that women tend to elect to take a bit more of the parental leave than men do anyway. So I think it's a complex issue, but it's one of these things that it's multifaceted, and the reasons for it existing, there's some are discrimination, and those need to absolutely be solved, because you can't have a situation where women are just discriminated against based on their gender. That's terrible. But there are some areas I think that we do need to kind of accept that there's just differences between men and women in the way they elect to do things. I'm conscious that like a white male talking about this might be a bit I know I can speak about it from a relatively, like preferred position. What do you feel on it yourself, Noma?
I think, when you have such debates and, going to your comment there to say I'm a white male, I think we are entitled to our opinions and we've observed the world. And perception can be a killer and perception can be really good. But based on your observation, like you've said, you've compared, we've got shared parental leave in the UK, actually. It is an option.
Geez, that's brilliant.
But then it's up to the individuals, like you've rightly said, in regards to choice. But, our minds, we've always done it this way, is what we always go back to. To try new things can be quite difficult. And sometimes, with the policies in terms of governments, like you've said, they will come up with something new. And for us to buy into it, it takes such a long time. That's due to the lack of education, is my opinion, to say, the education piece behind it is not really available. You have to search for it. And you have to know it very well for you to understand what the benefits are. And some people, when they think of shared parental leave, they're thinking, okay, well, we've got salary sacrifice, I think, in the UK. So basically, if your wife decides to go back, you can take a bit of that and then it balances the bills at home, essentially. Or he, in terms of different genders, basically, I don't want Twitter to come back to us on that comment. I'm working on my language choice. So essentially, yeah, but I think it's the educational piece. It always comes back to how do we disseminate the knowledge, which is what we do. It's what we're doing now, essentially, is how it's disseminated and how it's shown to the world in a positive light. Because sometimes when things are shared, the pros and cons, dependent on person, they'll highlight what they want to highlight, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's cultural kind of norm. One of the ones that I've always found about it was that I always think people confuse fair and even distributions. So we have this, like, whenever you see this kind of discourse on Twitter or something, people always tend to focus around 50-50, 50-50. And I always think that, they assume because it would be even that it would be fair. And that to a certain extent has a bit of a logic to it. Like, that it would make sense that if there's roughly 50% men and women, that the gender pay gap would be equal. But you get stuff like, I'm just using Sweden as a case study because I'm familiar with it. They brought in shared parental leave. So the idea was that, oh, well, now that men and women are given it shared between them, surely they'll pick it in 50-50. The wage gap won't be as big an issue. They found that men and women still kind of went back to what you're saying. It's like the cultural reset. Oh, well, the women take most of the leave. So, the women continue to take most of the leave again in Sweden. Then what they started doing was something I didn't really agree with. They started penalising the payment that they'd receive unless the men took a certain amount. And I don't really agree with that, because I think we have to draw a distinction between, if a disparity arises for a reason of like just an elective choice, is that really discrimination? Do you know, if the disparity arises for a certain reason that's a choice of the two parents, is that really, do you know what I mean? Is that an injustice, or is it just a misfortune of the choice? I realize Twitter will go mad over this, but that was just my cut. Do you know what I mean? I don't get why we have this fixation on 50. Like, it's like we're unwilling to accept that things can't work out evenly.
Subjective.
Yeah.
But do you know what? Germany, they've got something similar, because people weren't really having children, and to kind of entice people to start, having youngins, they came up with a really positive maternity incentive. So the government actually pays you, I think, for up to 12 months, which is 95% of your actual salary.
Brilliant.
And so I only had this at the BAM conference, literally, because someone had a paper on that. So that's how I know.
Fantastic.
So I haven't done the research. It's someone who was talking about it, and her research is literally looking at women and whether they actually want to go back to work after that.
And what did she find?
So her findings, some women, dependent on the line manager, they did want to go back. Others felt useless being at home, so they got another job. And then others changed jobs and the other group, they had a second child because they didn't want to go back.
Okay. What was the reasoning for, like, so a lot of them seem to want to, if not like not go back, change the kind of, is it a kind of a postnatal kind of, like, do they start to feel, because do they feel like idle at home because they're looking like they're out of the workplace and they don't really feel involved anymore? Is that it, or is it?
Their discourse was basically they realised that there wasn't a good mum, and that's debatable as well. How do I know that I'm a good mum? I mean, you've got pets. How do you know that you're a good dog dad?
Yeah, I just don't.
How do you quantify that?
God, I never would have thought of that. Obviously, because like I've got the male sunglasses on. Like,
no, but that's in German, so that's quite different in terms of culture as well. We have to think about that, and the economy is quite different to Ireland and the UK.
Yeah.
And also, I think their services are further afield compared to Ireland and the UK. Not that I'm biasing, but just from observation as well. In the Tinternet has told me that, so before you come for me. But no, it's quite interesting. And I guess the final question, because we've literally gone over our time, is PhD hard talk. You're laughing. You know, do you think it's a good way for us to disseminate, you know, our papers or our thesis? And do you think it's beneficial to the wider community for them to understand what we do and why we do it and why we're passionate? Or do you think pack it up, call it a day? That's it.
I do think it's really good. I do think it's really good. No, one of the reasons I think it's so good is that when you kind of start doing a PhD, I think the idea is that you become an expert, but like no one's gonna, if you look relatively young, no one's gonna go like, well, you can't be an expert. You know, like, because we associate experts in academia. No, but yeah, you know, I think of like, my idea of like an expert, like in like academia, is like, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the, you know, the tweed blazer with the patches, the pipe, like that's what you think of. You don't think of glasses. Like, but whereas like a lot of, like, if you go into universities, a lot of PhD researchers who publish research, and a lot of them wear skinny jeans and Converse, you know, like it's a totally different, it's a mismatch of like kind of why we think of them. The PhD hard talk thing, it gives people who are publishing in peer-reviewed journals, which does, I think, in a certain way, make them an expert in at least in the field they publish in. It gives them a platform that I don't think we have in the kind of the wider media outlets. I mean, over here, like it's difficult for PhD students in Ireland to publish media dissemination in kind of the traditional, the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, the Irish Examiner. They like to go for more of the senior lecturers or the professors, with good reason. I can understand why they do that, but outside kind of specific setup PhD student catered media dissemination outlets, like we have RT Brainstorm over here. I don't know if you have a similar thing for kind of early career researchers in the UK, but this is one of those that it gives young early career researchers fantastic chance to disseminate peer-reviewed published research on the Tinternet, as you say.
Internet. But yeah, thank you very much for your time. And I guess, you know, there's so much that you've reflected on, and you're quite logic actually in your discourse. I love it. I wish I was like that. Yeah. So
I wish I was too. I didn't know I was logical.
Well, you sounded logical to me, and I hope you sound logical to everyone at home. But no, it's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for discussing your research. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about Daragh, please look at the bottom, and there's several links to his paper and also his socials at the bottom. Remember, hashtag project dissemination to the world and hashtag sustainable knowledge to the world. So thank you very much for your time today, and I wish you well.
Thank you very much, Noma. It was a pleasure.
Graduated, elevated, now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves, take it to the top one time non-stop.